Hello and welcome. This week, we're going to get inside the head of Dr. Shama Rahman. She's a PhD neuroscientist who studies creativity and flow. And so this week, we're going to flow inside of her brain and learn how to get creative. She's going to teach us about the neuroscience of flow and creativity and how we can spend more time in those states. So welcome, Shama. We're excited to get inside your head.
I hope you like what you find in there.
I'm sure. So let's just begin with defining what flow is. It's a concept that we hear a lot about. What is this thing?
I think a lot of people have heard about flow in the context of being in the zone, and some other people also think it's focus, but actually there's a distinction between focus and flow. So flow, just to give you a little bit of background, was actually coined by a Hungarian psychologist called Csikszentmihalyi. So the way to say it is Csikszentmihalyi. And he was investigating what are the underlying correlates or principles or processes for happiness. And so he was working, he's one of the sort of forefathers of like positive psychology. He was carrying on the work of Jung, who's another obviously very famous psychologist. And what he discovered was that, notwithstanding the cultural differences of what I might consider to be happy or what you might consider to be happy, what seemed to be shared by people was this sort of intense, enhanced peak performance state of mind, which he then coined flow. And it has a couple of properties that are shared by everybody. So sometimes people say, okay, I completely lost track of time. That seems much shorter than it was, or that seems, much longer than it was. And then, they'd be like completely absorbed and engaged in that task. And normally flow happens when there's a balance between your skills and the challenges that are posed to you. So for example, I'm not a marathon runner, but if you get me to run the marathon, I would most probably find that too difficult until I
no flow.
Gather the skills, no flow. I'll just be like dying on the side of the road, right? And so that's when it kind of occurs. But then once you're in it, this sort of really interesting things that start happening. One of the things is the perception of time. It's intrinsically motivating. It's intrinsically rewarding. So people actually do feel happier when they're, in these states of flow. There's a sense of achievement. And cognitively speaking, people increase their mental flexibility when they're in flow. So they're very interesting, that one. Yeah, because it helps you to change strategy, makes you mentally more resilient. It's the exact opposite of stress, because in psychological terms, that's considered what they call functional fixedness, where you basically you fixate on one sort of aspect of something, you can't really see the wood for the trees, right? With flow, you're able to be a lot more flowy about it, right? And this is what I think leads to higher states of creativity, where you're able to have lots of different concepts that don't necessarily hold together normally in your head, but you are able to look at it and go, well, why not? What are these connections? What are these sort of like associations? And on that note, and going back to the difference with focus, is that, you're able to look at the little details, but you're also able to broaden out your attention from the details to, include the bigger picture. So
this is amazing. Okay. So flow is a state where you are losing track of time. People often describe it as being fully absorbed in something. And with it comes this ability to be more creative. So I guess this is where the intersection between flow and creativity comes from.
Absolutely. Yes. And so I was looking in my PhD, I was basically, first off, super interested in the idea of consciousness. And then everybody was like, great. Do you want to have career death as you start? And I was like, wait, what does that mean? It's like, you don't become a neurophilosopher until the end, when you can, you can kind of philosophize about something. And I was like, but I'm still really interested in consciousness. But okay, what about consciousness am I interested in? And for me, because my background is also a performer, I'm a musician and an actor and a storyteller, essentially. And I was just like, okay, clearly I'm interested in creativity. And what I see, I think creativity is almost like a phenotype of consciousness. It's what you actually see, what you can actually look at the processes of. It doesn't...
Like it's an expression of.
It's an expression of, exactly, the features of consciousness. And I think you're utilizing all of your brain and all of your, different aspects of what you are in order to be creative. So that's what I was interested in looking at. And I was looking at musicians, and I was looking using EEG, which I'm sure your listeners are now fully aware of. And I was interested to see, that moment of when people can create something from nothing. And there's lots of different types of creativity, actually. And there's lots of different stages of creativity. So I was drawing heavily on, people who'd done more qualitative studies of the creative processes, notably a guy called Wallace, for example, who went and interviewed like hundreds of eminent creatives. And that doesn't just mean fine artists and musicians. It also means chemists, architects, and he was like, well, what's the commonality between all of your processes? And it's nice to think about it as problem solving, right? And creativity is problem solving, innovation. And so I kind of used those sort of frameworks and thought, okay, this could really help me know where to look as far as like EEG or physiology is concerned. And also looking at, say, things like computational creativity, and then bringing in psychology models like flow. And so I found a signature brain pattern for when people were at, like, performing at their peak creative, which is when they're in flow. That is to long-windedly answer your
Okay, so I have
question.
to know, what is this brain signature for peak creativity and flow?
It's actually a complex one, right? And so flow, by my definition, or by Csikszentmihalyi's definition, is a complex cognitive behavior. It goes beyond focus. It goes beyond, like, say, relaxation. It seems to be in a sweet spot between the two places. And my hypothesis was that it wouldn't come from one particular part of the brain. It's not modular from that perspective. And I went into this idea of Connectionist Theories, which is the whole of the brain is required in order to create a higher cognitive behavior, such as that. So there are multiple regions of the brain involved, and there's different activation patterns that are involved when you look at it through time. And I looked at it, obviously, EEG musicians. And I think other people looked at it using MRI studies, and they looked at rappers and lyricists and poets, and similar areas are coming out, similar activation patterns are coming out. And what it says to me is really good news, because it means that it's domain and specific. It doesn't matter if you're talking or making music or whatever it is. So it's like, what it's showing to me is that there's a common neuronal network, the same way you and I share the same memory systems, but we access those memories differently. The memories are different, right? So that's I think flow means different things, to different people. So if you are creative, flow means being really creative. If you're an athlete, it means higher performance. It could mean employee engagement, well-being in other areas, right? So
let's dig into that for a minute, and then we'll get back to what this common brain network is. So when you look at flow, you're quite correct in saying it is different things to different people. So when I think about when I'm most in flow, it's various points.
Yeah.
One is between like 10 p.m. and 1 a.m. That's when I've always done my best work.
Yeah.
And when nobody bothers you, you're not hungry, there's nothing to distract you. And so you're just in this zone. And I've been extraordinarily creative, and like ideas feel like they're coming out of nowhere, and you just want to keep making. Wow. And I could be doing something boring, computationally based, boring organizing of stuff.
Yeah.
Or I could be doing something that's really engaged, making clothing or making art, creating new ideas or programs or protocols. And they all contain the same sensation of being simply me and the content, and nothing else matters at that point.
So it doesn't matter if it's boring work either. You can feel a distinct difference.
Yes.
Okay.
And I don't perceive it as boring. It's something that I would normally see as boring that might be rote. But you do it with this sort of inspired sense, the sense of sort of inspiration, for me, it's a sense of inspiration, a sense of, excitement about it, a sense of anything's possible, and you're sort of swimming with the content. Yeah. So that's one flow. There's another flow that I get into that a lot of people talk about, which is on the dance floor.
Okay.
You've got the music going, and you could be dancing for an hour and not realizing it.
True that.
Some people get it while they exercise.
Yeah.
And you're just doing that thing, and kind of nothing else matters. You might be having an internal dialogue that's going on, but it's very absorbed. Like you are absorbed in it. And then some people talk about extreme sports.
Yes, absolutely.
So to get into flow, often people do things like surfing or rock climbing, stuff that requires your 100% attention.
Yeah.
So it's fascinating that you have all of these kind of different guess we can use the term phenotypes, like all of these different forms of activity that somebody's taking on that look completely different. Some of them are individual, some of them are in group. People can talk about group flow too. You have like these amazing group experiences.
Yeah, co-creative sessions or like devising theater pieces together. Like it's, another buzz that I love.
Yeah, so you've got all these different things, but they all seem to have some underlying set of characteristics and patterns.
Yes, exactly. So, and that's where I think the cognitive commonalities can help us piece together, like, what is it that is creating all these different manifestations, what you might call an emergent property of, the sum of the parts that are interacting together. And it appears as different things to different people, but actually has these commonalities of mental flexibility, being able to look at the bigger picture at the same time as the details, being super aware of those things. And like the fact that you say, you're so absorbed, you want to do it more. That sort of thing. Yeah.
It's compelling. So what are these neural commonalities? What are the neural networks that seem to be engaged in each of these, across these various?
I mean, from what I could tell, there's about sort of 3 or 4 different areas that come together. Some of them are related in the frontal cortex, some of them in the dorsolateral cortex, and some of them in the precuneus area. And so the way that it kind of works, I think, is that it makes sense because individually these areas are responsible for different things. Some of it's related to attention, some of it's related to connectivity, where they act as a hub for other parts of the brain to talk to each other. Almost, I don't know, is there a traffic analogy there somewhere? I don't know.
The traffic controller.
In some way, yeah. Rather than like what I might have been expecting, which was like, I don't know, suddenly there's, all parts of the brain are connected to all parts and some critical mass, right? What I've been finding more was just like, actually, there are certain areas that allow connectivity faster than, say, your conscious decision-making brain might be doing, sort of thing. So that kind of makes sense as well, because, like there's a speed of connection of concepts and thoughts, and whether it's rock climbing or dancing or, being creatively in the composition of music or something like that. There's a bit of a difference, like where, if your frontal lobe, is very consciously involved in something, it tends to kind of pick something up, investigate it from all different angles, and then gives you a decision as to whether it's a good idea or not. That's quite slow. And it doesn't really, compute in a way, or is not conducive to the state of flow where everything seems to be, flowing very, very quickly. So these sorts of things kind of make sense. Another part of the brain is kind of like related to like self-editing and stuff like that. So it kind of, there's a lowerness of that. And
which part of the brain is that?
So kind of related to the dorsolateral, so and related to the activation pattern as well. So if say one's up and the other one's down and vice versa, sort of thing. It depends. Although, for example, if I'm talking about creativity, it's not always useful to be like coming out with lots of ideas. Sometimes it's useful to be editing them and analyzing them and going, well, is that a good idea? So there's a definite toolbox that's related to problem solving, and flow as related to that, for example. And there's lots of different stages before you get into flow, right? And so the enablements of flow are possibly different as well,
so This is incredibly cool. We have multiple brain regions, some of which are responsible for making decisions and activating regions of the brain faster than our prefrontal cortex, which, although is amazing at making decisions, it's kind of slow and clunky. So you have the sort of internal execution process that takes over when you move into flow. And depending on what you need at the moment, you can move into different kind of toolboxes in your brain.
Yeah. And also, there's also like an area that's related to defocused attention as well.
Let's talk about that.
That's kind of interesting. So again, in the same way, like you probably so one of the stages in problem solving is right at the beginning, which is preparation. What does that mean? It literally means you're researching a lot. You have a razor sharp focus actually, and you're trying to ingest a lot of things. You probably have a broad idea of what you're trying to look at, but really what you're doing is you're trying to define that more and more, refine it by kind of following some hypotheses and then learning from that. But then that it doesn't help to carry on being in that razor sharp attention state. You should actually put it to one side and what they call incubate, which would mean like you go for a walk, talk to your friends, make some, good food. Don't do another PhD in maths. The point is like not to tax the brain, because what it's then doing is like allowing the percolation to happen in a defocused way, allowing concepts to come together, juxtapose, hit together and kind of go, well, yeah, okay. So part of that's again to do with like not self-editing as you're going along and not dismissing an idea before even, comes to fruition.
That's very cool. So if we were to get into flow, what are some of your recommendations?
I mean, I'm half kind of said it when it comes to problem solving, for example, creativity or whatever it is. I think a lot of people might go, oh yeah, I'm just going to be hit with that bolt of inspiration. I go to a mountain, sit under a tree and all that sort of stuff. Whilst that might be true, you also need to do the work beforehand, which is like, you know, some of this work, you know, in terms of the preparation, the research, even try out some of your ideas, like give it a go, you know, and then you need to like relax. So, you know, other researchers have looked at that particular aspect, and it turns out that the default mode network is what comes into play then. And by definition, it gives you an idea of what the default mode network is. It's what your brain is doing when you're not making it do other things, basically. Yep. And so it comes up highly in mind wandering and daydreaming. So let yourself dream, which I know is not easy, especially in like our current work situations and like what we expect of ourselves as well. And I think it's something that, you know, you need to learn how to integrate cutting yourself some slack within, you know, that entire process, because that's when then after incubation, you get into this aha, like eureka insight moment where you get that like light bulb like going off, probably in the shower. I don't know. Maybe people need to look at like, you know, the frequency of the sound of water. I have no idea. So, you know, and then I think because all of this sort of framework came about maybe nearly 100 years ago now, right? Really, flow kind of became more into its own, I would say probably from the 70s onwards. I reckon this is kind of when flow slots in, you know, so say if you're a coder, you get your idea and then you get into this sort of flow of coding, you get your next idea. So you kind of cycle in between those two sort of moments, I think. And
so you cycle between the creative inspiration and then the execution,
I would
which
say,
is a flow?
I would say,
okay.
Yeah. I mean, maybe even the inspiration of the ideas that are coming through as well. There's possibly a gateway, right? And say in brainstorming, you're like, aha, let's flow with that. You know, and then that becomes like, it kind of like snowballs. And then you're like, and then maybe another idea comes with it and then it snowballs sort of thing. So it doesn't always have to be in the execution, but kind of maybe the path of it, I would say. I think you do that for a while and then you come out of it, which I think is very important to highlight as well. As, you know, you're not meant to be in flow like 24/7.
Okay. This is an important point because people who are obsessed with flow are like, why aren't, you know, I want to be in flow right now.
Yeah. It's a very energy intensive activity because like, you know, so going back to my thing about being a marathon runner or not, right? Like, it happens in this sweet spot of when you're being stimulated just enough. But after that, it becomes stress, right? But, you know, in order to even get to that sweet spot, there's a stimulation that's happening. Energy is being put into that. The fact that you can have focus and a big attention at the same time is energy intensive, right? And so I think, you know, another thing would be sleep well, you know, and after a while, you know, you will run out of that energy and it's time to kind of chill and then show yourself, your audience, your colleagues, what work you've made, and then take on that feedback and reiterate the whole thing. So it's okay to be messy it's okay to have that uncertainty in a creative process or whatever it is and just go with it, you know? Yeah.
So if we were looking at really practical tips for how somebody would get into flow, what would you say?
So some of the things that we've already mentioned, I guess.
We can reiterate.
Yeah.
This is the sum up. Practical tips for getting into flow.
Practical tips. When it comes to the perspective of, say, maybe not only problem solving, but yeah, do your work in terms of prepare around the subject, then allow your brain to breathe, essentially, take a break, you know, and allow yourself to do something different and allow, you know, your brain to carry on doing the work without you getting in the way. And then, you know, some people also swear by this idea of like, if you can feel the idea coming, you know, look at a piece of like white, so, you know, it doesn't clutter your visual attention or something like that. Let that idea come through and then go with it, you know, in terms of the actual flow that then will ensue. I think also like try not to have distractions, you know, pinging phones and that doesn't really help when you're in that space. But I would say when you're in it, you are in it. It'll be there for a while. So
how often So does almost everybody achieve flow?
I think everybody is able to achieve flow. Yeah.
So I look around at, the employees in our office, for example, and I see people clacking away. I see this look on their face sometimes, and they're working on something. They're engaged. They're doing something. Yeah. Is it likely that, during an office day, if you're engaged in doing something and enjoying what you're doing, you are entering a state of flow at that moment?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And engagement and high meaningful engagement is definitely one of the properties of flow, for sure. And yeah, you can definitely be. That's what I'm investigating actually at this moment, is looking at flow within work. So
cool, because people often talk about flow as this super precious thing. It's only when you're rock climbing or surfing or at your best creative moment.
Yeah.
But the reality is we often probably go in and out of flow during our day. When we're at the office working on something great, we're in flow. When we're in a really interesting conversation that you're absorbed in, you're like, wow, this is amazing. Like, let me learn more.
Totally.
That is a state of flow in that conversation.
Absolutely. And it's nice how it kind of links into natural language as well. I know flow is a term, but it's also within our language for a reason, I guess.
Yes, it's a beautiful concept. We're flowing with one another and flowing with the material.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, when you're an athlete or a dancer or a musician, getting into flow is part of the training. And so that's actually what you're achieving anyway. So, when you're trying to improvise, or when you're trying to do this rock climbing, and you're trying to do this incredible piece of dance that you're trying to execute, right? It's just that, most other people who don't have that within their training may not recognize it as such, right?
Nice.
And people have definitely been in flow. Maybe it's transient. Maybe they don't realize that it's flow. And part of the work I'm doing now is basically how to bring in that education so that most people can access it quicker and more reliably, and even to recognize it for themselves, So
audience, I wonder where moments are that you've achieved flow. There's probably moments that you don't realize. Probably having sex, cooking dinner.
I was thinking that,
no,
for sure.
Cooking is very much one of those sort of creative flow if you're a good cook, if it doesn't seem stressful and you're not trying to cook to impress somebody, you're just cooking to play. You're just cooking to make an experience. Yeah. You're throwing stuff together. It's creative. It's you and the food. That's a moment of flow.
Absolutely. My friend said that they get into flow when they're doing the washing up. Something as mundane as that, which you might consider, right? And I guess it'll happen at that sort of moment of, if you're learning something as well, right? You probably get into moments of flow when you feel that your abilities to match that challenge are stepping up to the plate. And then if it's too hard, it gets frustrating, right? So go easy on yourself if you're trying to get into like learning and flow through learning, and vice versa. So
cool. So a lot of what you've talked about at moments has sounded like meditation, and at moments have diverted from that.
Okay, yeah.
So what do you see as the correlates or crossover definitional, functional interactions between meditation and flow?
I think we were talking about this as well, yeah. And I'd be interested to hear your divergence points as well. But I think actually the commonalities, I think you can have a practice to try and achieve flow just as much as you can have a practice to achieve meditation. I think the two mental states are different, but they're related to each other. And it could be that meditation is an enabler to help you get into flow. Perhaps it helps, the almost like a muscle to learn how to be open. Right. And not be constantly editing your thoughts, and how to be still in order to allow those, in moments of insights to come to you in the first place. Maybe it helps us kind of be more receptive to even get into this intense state.
I would completely agree with that. Certainly meditation teaches you the discipline of shutting down your edits. It teaches the discipline of being in, for some people, flow is a still thing. You're at your desk, you're working. It teaches you the discipline of avoiding the distractions which pull you out of flow and keep you from flow. So if you're just sort of ruminating in distraction, you are the opposite of flow.
That's a good point. Yeah.
And you have to clear that space to do it.
So the ability to deal with distractions in a more disciplined way, I guess. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the ability to be able to focus your mind and hyper-focus. In meditation, there are various forms of meditation. So you have a focused attention meditation, which, might be the process that gets you in there.
Yeah.
And then you also you can move into, for example, open monitoring, where you're now opening your attention to all of the things around you. So that also sounded very similar when you described this process of flow, of being able to then be open to the things around you.
Yeah, I also came across this type of Zen meditation. I don't know, there must be loads of different types, but where you meditate with your eyes half closed. So you're trying to consolidate the inner and the outer world. And that seemed to be quite similar to the process of when you're trying to be simultaneous in the focus and the broad attention. Maybe there's a divergence in other types of meditation when you kind of do that more linearly, maybe, but perhaps it helps, the muscles essentially of being able to know what focus is and to know what broadening your attention is.
The one place where I definitely noticed a divergence was in the neurology of it. So you mentioned an increase or utilization of the default mode network, whereas in a lot of studies on meditation, we see a decrease in default mode network activity, which relates to a decrease in the mental chatter that you experience within meditation.
So what are the areas in neurology for meditation?
So in the neuroscience of meditation, we see quite a number of things. We see an increase in the prefrontal cortex. We see increased activity in the insula, which might also be related to the sensory aspects of meditation, like doing body scans, etc. We see a downregulation of the amygdala, which you probably also see in flow. It's not an anxious state. You feel really good.
Yeah.
We see increase in sometimes hippocampal activity, and we definitely see an increase in hippocampal volume over time.
That's interesting. Like what memories?
You see an increase in hippocampus. I mean, you can then
extrapolate
what you might what that might mean. But one of the common things that you see is this decrease in the default mode network.
So the default mode network that I was mentioning was the period of incubation before you get your insight.
Prior to flow. Okay.
Yes. So maybe there's not so much of a divergence. I don't know. But yeah, maybe actually, the hippocampus I haven't seen within this. Certainly there's a U-shaped relationship with stress.
I should say that the hippocampus is in studies of long-term meditators. The resting state now tends to have increased volume of hippocampus, which would, suggest that there is a relationship between hippocampal activity. It's not necessarily during the moment of meditation, but we see an overall increase in hippocampus volume in long-term meditators.
Right. Yeah.
In general, in some studies.
So you have your expert versus novice populations, and in terms of meditation as well, which could show different methods or patterns of activity and stuff. But I can see those sort of divergences there, and the commonalities, like you said, with the amygdala. I haven't managed to see necessarily what's happening with the amygdala, but there's a U-shaped relationship between flow and stress, for example. So you get to, when I say stress, I mean more like arousal or stimulation. After a certain point, that stimulation is considered stress. So in a way, it's an inverse relationship with stress. So the more stressed out you get, the less likely you are to get into flow.
So there's another reason why meditation may be something that allows you to enter flow more effectively.
Yeah, exactly. If it calms you down and the peacefulness of it all, for sure. Yeah.
So let's turn now to creativity. So how do you define creativity? You talked about the definition a little bit early on.
Yeah. Creativity is a number of different things. It's notoriously difficult because everybody goes, oh, that's subjective, isn't it? One of the first things that come to mind for creativity is it novel? Now, the appreciation of that novelty is another question, because there's also another sort of U-shaped relationship between what's acceptable novelty and what's just considered bizarre. And that's actually true. And, sometimes people be like, okay, that's way before its time, which, happens a lot between artists that are posthumously recognized, for example, or just considered bizarre. And that's that. And so novelty is one of those things. Differentiating ideas from what's around at the moment is another way of putting that. There is an element, I think, of the receiver, of said creative work even, considering it to be aesthetically pleasing, or sensorially pleasing, or thought-provoking, and does it challenge the status quo in some way? And another one is it useful? That's another thing. So what does it mean to be useful in the context of art? right? I think a lot, but maybe the word useful needs to be modified in that case. So I guess it's really beauty is in the eye of the beholder with creativity.
Maybe we could use the term meaningful instead of useful.
Totally. Exactly. And do I find it meaningful versus do you find it meaningful? And that's the same piece of art, right? And so that's where the subjectivity starts coming in. But when it comes to, things like innovation, or if you look at scientific creativity, which is solving a problem possibly, or coming up with a new method to do something, then useful comes back into it again. And in that case, useful to whom? Again, and to how many people, or, to a certain niche, or, there's quite a wide spanning thing.
So some people look at themselves and say like, oh no, I'm not creative. Maybe you're creative, but I'm not creative. What would you say to somebody like that?
I totally disagree with you. I think everybody's creative, and you're constantly being creative, whether you realize it or not. And that's why I have to say things like problem solving, or, did you say you're the director of innovation or something? That's definitely you creating something, innovating something. So changing strategy for something, that is being mentally flexible. I think at the moment, the core cognitive element of creativity is to be mentally flexible. So
let's take it down even a few notches from the director of innovation of something.
Yes.
So, any mother, incredibly creative.
Absolutely.
Most people making dinner, if you're trying a new recipe or putting together, new combinations.
Yes. Totally
creative.
Totally. I actually definitely think that one is very true, especially if you're trying to make food for friends who are ranging from anything between carnivorous to vegan to, whatever else in between, flexitarian. You're like, how am I going to make this happen? Right. So it's meeting a challenge.
Or having an interesting conversation in which you are coming up with novel ideas, or responding to somebody in a way that was not necessarily wrote for you.
I think, that's another thing. It's like you can have a task that you're trying to meet, or you could just be roving with no, discernible objective at the end of the road. You could just be like, I want to take this route because it's interesting, and I'm exploring possibilities. Or, if you're like, imagine if, that's all creativity, where you're able to sort of visualize situations that may not be the case in this particular reality yet, sort of thing.
So putting together new things that may not necessarily be in front of you, or combining new ideas in new ways.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And new is a definition for the self. So it doesn't have to be new for the world to be creative. It can just be new for yourself in order to be creative for you.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it has this great element of growth involved with creativity or transformation, or, the way to allow you to see something differently, even perception, for sure. Changing your perception about something. I think that's using similar sort of muscles in the brain.
So what are these brain muscles that we might be using as we're being creative?
Well, I mean, as I was mentioning, what I was looking at flow through the lens of creativity. And so, do you mean neuronally speaking?
Yeah.
Like we mentioned the default mode network, we mentioned the,
So default mode network in this case being a facilitator of creativity, or something that helps you kind of search for new ideas, or have this internal dream process.
And that dream process is quite interesting in how it could occur, when it could occur, right? So it could be mind wandering or daydreaming. It could be you going for a walk and measuring out your thoughts. It could be not thinking about it at all, but trusting in the fact that your brain is. It's also percolating down to the lower than the conscious awareness level. It could be during your dreams. And it could be in this state called hypnagogia, which is between sleep and wake.
Which is the most amazing state. Tonight as you go to bed, take a moment and just see what's happening in your brain as you're falling asleep. This is a hard thing to do, because when you start to look for sleep, you then can't sleep.
Yeah.
The great Richard Feynman thing. But
True
when
that,
you start to realize it, you realize that you can be in this incredible state as you're falling asleep, where imagery is happening, stories are being told, you can still comprehend them, and they make no sense at all. They are amazing.
Yeah.
And you're going from the state where you have a narrative that's making perfect logical sense, and then all of a sudden, the person is starting to walk up the sky.
Yeah. Or something even more random than that. And you can't even put it into words, right?
Yeah. This is the hypnagogic state.
Yeah. And also, maybe when you're waking up, because, sometimes people go, they reach for their their notepad as soon as they're waking up because this incredible dream has come to them or whatever, I've woken up with entire tunes in my head where I've just gone straight and I've gone, right, I have to sing it in order to remember it or retain it in some way. I'll hum it to myself, before all goes away. So even if it's not maybe going into sleep, coming out of it, it's had plenty of time to incubate,
So what are some other brain regions that may be at play in creativity?
So I guess, incubation is the second stage, right? The first stage, as I was mentioning, would be the preparation stage. So this is, I guess, what you would do when you're like looking through for research, probably browsing, probably kind of, from the art perspective, maybe you're looking at other sort of techniques or other people's work, maybe you're kind of going, well, what am I creating for? What's my objectives? It's all quite a logical state in some ways, but you are actually doing the work and filling your brain with lots of like ingredients to play with is what I would consider, lots of little like Lego blocks to then go, oh, okay, in order to put them in different permutations and things. So I would suggest like just absorb as much as you can in those particular moments. And, does that mean going to lots of like museums or whatever it is, lots of cultural events, the idea being you put in so many different things in a way or so much volume of something, then it starts, patterns start emerging. And we're really good pattern detectors. And I think that's where like a lot of creativity comes in as well. It could be like, here's a new pattern you may not have thought about. So yeah, I think for that perspective, the frontal lobe is definitely involved and your hippocampus is definitely going to be involved because there's elements of memory that are coming into that, right? And whether you want to like rehash those memories, whether it's long-term memory or short-term memory, I mean, obviously, if you're looking at a particular subject, it's probably going to be short-term memory as it's trying to be, consolidated. But that's all very attention dominant, right? So your attention is very much involved in it. If you ask me what I just, research, I'll be able to tell you. And then if I kind of go and let it percolate, I'll be like, wait 1 second, let the idea come to me, right? I may not be able to tell you sort of thing. So yeah. That's the first stage and the second stage of the incubation. My supervisor was also looking at the areas looking during insight when you have that eureka moment. And it was actually alpha waves in the sort of occipital region where there's a burst, alpha and gamma, which is quite interesting. And that was like trying to solve a riddle when it's a very obvious situation of having an insight because, there's one answer and you don't have an answer and then you suddenly have an answer. So that's a cool paradigm to be looking at.
The alpha burst. Aha.
I have it, and then like, what do you do with that information?
So this is probably a kind of reaching correlation, but maybe I'm saying this half joking. But so the occipital lobe is responsible for your visual experience, and most of our alpha waves are generated from our occipital lobe. That is where the generator is. But when we think about the idea of aha, I have an idea, the ping idea we use is the light bulb goes off.
Totally.
So we are talking about this huge, burst of, momentary burst within your visual cortex area.
Wow, I never thought of it that way. Is that an actual synesthetic?
I don't know.
Oh my
I'm kind of saying it jokingly, but
maybe that's why we describe it like that, because it's the experience of it, right?
We have just a hypothesis.
Oh my God, that's really cool. I like that. When people ask me, they're like, oh my God, you're measuring creativity. Don't you think you're like constraining it? I was like, no, man. Like I'm trying to demystify the process in order to allow you to have a mystical experience still. Do you know what I mean? I think anyway. So that's really cool.
As a scientist, people always, so I'm one of those weird, highly creative scientists, which is not weird because really all scientists are creative.
Absolutely.
And people would always say, like, oh, science, isn't that so constraining? And as a child, I'd feel like, because I was one of those highly creative things everywhere kind of people. I want to just make stuff in all domains. And I hated the scientific method because it seemed so rigid. And adults who were more intelligent than I was and had, wisdom would say, well, the scientific method frees you up to be creative. And that thought was always crazy to me until I actually started to bring practice to multiple domains in which you recognize that you need some sort of construct. And when you have a construct set up, you really can then be extraordinarily free to create within that construct.
Absolutely. part of it's called creative constraint almost, right? So it could be like, okay, like pretend you have your arm like tied up behind your back. Now go and do something. And actually you start moving differently because, you now have one arm less or something. And you wouldn't have thought about it. And yet it's a constraint, right? So it's a kind of a paradox there already. And then, part of the things I was very interested in is like, how can you have thought frameworks in order to enable creativity, right? Which is still very flexible.
So tell us how you enable creativity.
So the one that I was mentioning to you is a really favorite of mine from Wallace because it's very broad and it allows personal freedom within that. If I just say preparation, I'm just telling you that's what you got to do, but how you prepare is up to you, right? And similarly, incubation, there's also other things like design thinking frameworks that, people are taking into like companies in order to help with systems and how, organizations are put together, and it's very interesting because communication is a very big part of creativity and also flow, right? And how can you enable that faster or in a more meaningful or engaging or efficient manner, right? And so I think some of these frameworks are literally structurally related and literally cognitively related at the same time. And so if you can give those like, here's a milestone and here's a milestone, how you get there, essentially up to you. But at least it's a milestone that you recognize. It allows you to work a lot within those constraints, but also be like, okay, I've finished this path, then I've gone into this path, and now I'm into this path. It helps, because I think it can be quite easy to get frustrated in the creative path.
Yes. and that might be part of it.
It is part of it. And I think one of the things that I've learned as I've gone along is to just be like, expect it. Expect that it's not going to be a linear thing. Expect that there are curveballs. Expect that you're going to go 2 steps backwards. And you just don't expect it to be like linear. But then I've sort of reduced my frustration at it. After a while, because I'm just like, this is just how it is. And actually, the less time I spend stuck in frustration, the better outcomes I get, or the quicker I get to my place.
So there's another place where mindfulness can be helpful in teaching you when the frustration rises to deal with the sensation of frustration so you can get back to work. I've also found frustration to be very helpful, particularly to prompt me to be creative. So there are some nights where it's just like, I have this feeling that I need to make something.
Absolutely.
And the frustration of needing to make something is like burning inside of me until I can't not do it.
Okay. Is that frustration or anticipation?
That's frustration.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Anticipation is a different feeling. So there's nights when I'm like, I'm going to do this. It feels great. I feel it like rising and it's awesome. And that's just like pure motivation. I'm skyrocketing into it. And there's other times when I haven't done something overtly. I deeply believe we as humans are constantly doing things that are creative all the time. So there's times when I haven't done something that's overtly creative, go and make this big thing.
Yeah.
And that's when I'll feel the frustration pent up inside me. And it often propels me to my best work because it pushes me beyond the boundary. It pushes me beyond the like, okay, I'm just going to sit in my nice little life and do the things I normally do, to be like, I just have to do something now.
Yeah.
And it really frees me. Often like the stuff is physical, often the stuff is big, sometimes it's not, sometimes it's small. But it like pushes me beyond any of those sensations of barriers. Because as a creative individual, or even as a not creative individual, because we're all creative individuals.
We are, yeah.
As a creative individual, there's this often the sensation of barrier because creation is such a weird, novel thing.
Okay.
So, you're sitting in the world as it currently is. And to change something can often be quite scary. Or to make the steps. Like you've got a blank canvas in front of you. And to actually take the step to make a mark on that canvas can be terrifying because, you don't know what you're going to do. You don't know what's going to come out. You're going to mark this beautiful piece of paper.
And especially it might be wrong.
Yeah.
But maybe there's no wrong.
And so to take that step over the creative threshold, to take that first step of action and to be like, I can do this thing that's not normal. I can do this thing that's not status quo. I can do this thing that is changing what's around me.
Yeah.
And it might get really messy and it might be really weird. And I can sit and be okay with that.
Yeah. So the courage to sit with it.
Yeah.
Be okay with uncertainty.
And to just take that step over the threshold.
And I think to be like unclear about where you're going to end up is perfectly okay. Until it becomes clearer and clearer. And then maybe you're like, well, actually, it's not that at all. I need to pivot. And that's okay too. And would you say that frustration is it because you feel like there's a pent up release that needs to come through?
For sure. There's a pent up release. And sometimes it's just like, there's also, there's always the tension with procrastination because it's much easier to not do something than it is to do something.
Yeah.
So that frustration pushes me over the pent up inertia of not doing anything.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah, I get that. Yeah. So that makes me think about like how maybe we need to be in flow, like quite often. Or, we need that as a form of like, I mean, I personally used to consider creativity as a oiling of all the cogs in the consciousness sphere, like of the wheels within that. So it's like this perfect thing where it's all working. If you were to look at it as some sort of mechanical toy where all the cogs and the wheels are turning correctly and together and, harmoniously. So I wonder, like a lubricant almost, and yeah, I wonder whether I personally feel more happy and fulfilled and more myself when I've been in flow or when I've been creative quite regularly.
Well, the research certainly supports that notion. I mean, you look at the classic Harvard study that says that 46.9% of the time our mind is thinking about something other than what we're currently doing. And when we are fully engaged in the moment, we are truly happy. And so flow is by definition that time when you're truly engaged, when your mind is shut off from all the other, worries about past and future, and you're just in the present. And so when people talk about, why is mindfulness so amazing? Why is everybody like talking about this mindfulness thing? When you really get mindfulness, that's what it gives you. It gives you this extraordinary ability to be in the moment. And when you're there, it's really happy.
So the presence of it all, which I think is again another commonality, right? With flow. So.
And mindfulness.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you were talking about how creativity kind of is in some ways the ultimate expression of consciousness.
Yeah, I was calling it the phenotype, where the consciousness might be the genotype, right?
The oiling of the cogs.
Yeah.
So to you, creativity is sort of the ultimate being conscious?
I think the process of it is as if it's a manifestation of consciousness. Right?
Can we roll back and define consciousness for a second?
Yeah, I know. That's difficult, right? Isn't it called the hard problem of consciousness for a reason? I think some people consider consciousness to be like visual presence, for example, or, being able to be like detect that that's a lamp, versus it being some amorphous shape that I may or may not be aware of. Or other people might look at consciousness as awareness. Others might be like, okay, it's sentience. It's the fact that I have, an opinion about things. Or maybe the ability to plan for the future and reminisce about the past. Or, I don't know, the ability to have an identity or, how I relate to other people, I mean, the simplest way of saying is I think, the consciousness is the awareness of being, right? Or knowing that you exist in some way. I know it sounds very hippie when I say that, but
maybe knowing that you exist and there's a world around you that you can perceive. So another definition of consciousness is it's sort of an old one, the binding principle, the idea that the percepts of your experience, the individual pieces of your visual, audio, sensory experience are coming together at one moment. They're bound together. And that moment when they come together, when you're aware that everything hangs together and exists and works in all of your sensory experience, internal and external, that is the moment of consciousness.
I think that really, really nicely describes how I feel creativity is. So for me, I hold it very highly in esteem in my experience of life is when I have those moments, because I literally feel that that's when everything comes together. So it's helping me, I suppose, experience my existence in a way.
Amazing. Well, thank you very much for showing us how we can experience our existence.
I mean, not so lofty as that, but for me, I guess, that's what keeps me going. So, yeah.
And you have a company that you've now created to help bring these ideas to people and help them enable these moments more often.
Yeah.
Tell us about NeuroCreate.
NeuroCreate. Yeah, I guess creativity is in the very name. So I guess my thing was, I would love to be able to help more people achieve these states of flow and also be more creative? And how can we democratize this, and scale this? And so we're creating like a digital platform that brings together a symbiotic design between neuroscience, positive psychology, design thinking frameworks, and the abilities of AI in order to create a platform that can enable you to reach these states of flow. And some of it would be using neural data. So we've actually been looking at using the Muse, obviously, which have given us very good correlates for our deep learning model. So that's very cool. So using neurofeedback to help people get into flow. And the other one is like actually like looking at these thought frameworks, right? And how we can create a digital version of these thought frameworks so people can actually go through them themselves and use it whenever they like. So, as I said before, flow means different things to different people. So we have something that's a bit more geared towards creativity to enable you to be more sort of coming up with novel ideas quickly, faster, efficiently, quality ideas, within brainstorming. And the other element is also like engagement, well-being, and performance to other people. So whether that's within employees and within, for me, it's also about integrating it into your own workflow. So everything that we're doing is trying to create it within your workflow. So that's what we're doing.
And where can people learn more about NeuroCreate and you?
So there's a website, and it's www.neurocreate.co.uk. We're actually based in London, UK. So that's hence the URL there. Myself, I am kind of over the internet. It depends if you're looking for me as a scientist or as a performer. But yeah, type in Shama Rahman and perhaps sitar, and you might get the performance angle of things. And neuroscience, you'll get the other side of things. So
amazing. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for letting us inside your head today.
I hope you liked what you found.
Absolutely. Very creative, very inspiring.
Thank you very much. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah. My pleasure. So I have a silly thought. In this process of conversation, we've been in flow, in and out of flow with one another, and we've talked about creativity. Can we sing together and explore creative flow?
Yeah, co-creatively. Summertime and the living is easy. Fish are jumping and the cotton is high. Boy, your daddy's rich and your ma is good looking. So hush, little baby. No.